Hey everybody, and welcome to chapter number 12 of Cognitive Psychology. We are talking about problem solving and intelligence. I am joined, as always, with my faithful pal Fozzie, who you can see sleeping over there in the corner, as always, making sure that I get all this right. If I misspeak or get anything wrong, he starts barking. He will let me know. So let's get into it. What are we talking about today? So today feels a little bit scattershot, especially if you're looking at the agenda, right? Because we're talking about problem solving. We're also going to be talking about creativity and intelligence. So three areas that don't always feel like they are related. However, I've mentioned, when I was writing the textbook for this course, I looked a lot at other textbooks and, to see how do they organize their information, how do they present their information, what did I like, what did I not like about how they do those things. And one of the things that I saw a lot is that problem solving was very rarely just a chapter by itself. Sometimes it wasn't even a chapter. Sometimes people would just not include it in a cognitive psychology textbook. But when it was included, it was oftentimes paired up with either intelligence or creativity. So creativity is it's also not always covered in cognitive psychology classes, but I get enough questions about it that I wanted to include it a little bit here. So let's get into it. Let's talk a little bit about problem solving. As always, we need to define our terms. We need to talk about, well, what do we even mean by problem solving? You can see I've written it 3 times in 3 separate lines. What does it mean? Well, Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines, I'm just kidding, I'm not going to define that with a dictionary definition, but problem solving is one of those things that feels a little, I know this is corny to say, but it's one of those things that you know it when you see it, right? That there are so many things that could be considered elements of problem solving. Me recording this video is an example of problem solving. Me going to Subway to buy a sandwich is problem solving. Me pumping gas in my car is problem solving. What do all those things have in common? Basically, what they have in common is some element of planning, where basically you have what we call a goal state. So we have something that we want to have accomplished, but we aren't there yet. And so the problem solving aspect is figuring out how do we get from where we are now to where we want to be. That can be, like I said, really mundane, pumping gas in your car. It can also be going to college and making good grades so that way you can have a solid career and provide for a future family. So problem solving can be something as simple and as ordinary as unscrewing a jar of pickles. It can also be something as complicated as figuring out the rest of your life, right? So there's a lot of ground to cover here. And I think honestly that's kind of the thing that rubs me the wrong way about this chapter, is that it does feel a little on the shallow end. And I think the reason for that is because we need to be able to account for all of those different elements of problem solving. We need to be able to talk about problems big and small. So, and we're going to be exploring this a lot. When we talk about creativity, intelligence, we're also going to circle back and talk about what that means for problem solving. So is this unique to humans? Can you think of an example of problem solving not in humans? Think about your pets. If you have a dog, a cat, or a bird, good chance you've probably seen them solve something. Maybe it's get out of their cage or their pen. Maybe it's get out of the yard. Or maybe it's fooling you into, like I always wonder whenever I am doing tricks with my dog, whenever I get him to shake hands with me, to me, I think, I've trained my dog, right? He knows now whenever I say that word that he can do something and that he gets treats for it. But I wonder from his perspective, is he kind of like, hey, my adult, my human, he keeps saying this thing, and what I found is that, like, if I give him my paw, then he'll stop doing that. So I always wonder, but for him, that is a problem. For both of us, it is a problem on both sides. So we know that non-humans can probably problem solve, but what are the limits to it? I have a couple of videos here for you. The one that I specifically want to look at is with crows and with corvids. You've probably heard before that crows and corvids are very smart, but what does that mean? At least with like monkeys, like, we talked about with apes in the language chapter, that they have some approximations to language, so, that makes them look smart, but I don't know, I've never really seen a bird do anything that was smart, right? Well, what you see in this particular experiment They have a worm in this water. The crow can't reach that worm, and so in order to get it, what it's going to do is it's going to take these small little weights, drop it into the water so that the water level rises, so that it can reach in there and grab this little grub right here. Is that smart? I think usually people say, when people describe that behavior, they say that it's smart. But it is also problem solving, right? So we can see this early overlap between intelligence and problem solving. And what I want to try to highlight here is partly that, yes, they are related, but that we shouldn't consider them exactly the same thing, right? Because if what we are saying is that this bird is smart because of its ability to solve problems, then is this an intelligence test? And if so, what does it mean if you can't solve it, right? So do you see what I mean? Like a lot of times when we talk about like problem solving and intelligence, we talk about task-specific behaviors. So I want you to think, is this just something that crows are good at, or are they actually smart, whatever that might mean? So here is a video where we can kind of see some crows in action.
Ring, make it, ring, girl, make it.
Apartment 2B?
2B! She's definitely using that Grubhub deal from Amazon.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Amazon.
Over. Here we go.
Crows have become highly skilled at making a living in these new urban environments. In this Japanese city, they have devised a way of eating a food that normally they can't manage. Dropping a nut from a great height onto a hard road does sometimes crack it.
Okay, how cool is that, right? I apologize for the video quality on here. As I mentioned before, BBC Studios is notoriously difficult about their copyright stuff. Even a previous video, you probably noticed that there was a video. I think it was in the language chapter where BBC struck my account for copyright infringement because I included one of those things embedded. So what we saw here is this crow took a nut, which its beak is not strong enough to crack. Its beak is not, the crow's beaks are not really, quote unquote, designed for cracking nuts. It's good at getting larvae and, you know, like pecking at things. But so what it's trying to do here is slam that nut against the concrete so that it opens up. Is this an example of problem solving? I think that it is, right? If we think about problem solving as like there's some kind of goal state that you're trying to reach, but you're not there yet, and you have to employ some number of behaviors or tool use operations in order to achieve that goal. In my opinion, that is kind of what we saw here, right? Crow threw it against the ground so it could try to get inside of that nut. Now, the question is that an intelligent thing to do, though? I mean, I think that it is, right? It seems like I think of that as being like a smart thing. Okay, so let's watch a little bit further and see if our opinion changes.
But some nuts are particularly tough. So the crows have devised a better way. Drop it among the traffic. The problem now is collecting the bits without getting run over. So some birds have refined their technique. They station themselves beside pedestrian crossings. Wait for the lights to stop the traffic. Then collect your cracked nut in safety.
All right, cool, right? Who knew that crows were so smart? And one of the fun things about this, so that video, as I mentioned, is a little bit on the older side now. That this is one of, as some of you know, that crows can even develop cultures where they have certain social routines that can be passed down through generations. And what they found with these crows is that this strategy started out in one town in Japan and has kind of spread out to other nearby cities, showing that this is not just a way to problem solve, but is also something that other crows can learn through observation and employ for themselves. So as we go through this video, I think that's extremely impressive, actually, like what they're doing there. And I'm hoping that as we kind of walk through this chapter, we'll kind of unpack, number one, why it's so impressive, but also number two, how they were able to figure this stuff out. So let's talk about how we approach problems. And in order to do that, much like with the decision-making chapter, I'm going to be showing you a couple of examples of problem solving gone wrong. And this isn't to show that we are bad at problem solving, but rather to show that in these examples, that the reason why they're helpful and instructive examples is because they show us where our normal problem solving strategies, which are usually very successful, where they go wrong. So let's talk about this particular case of the chicken, the grain, and the wolf, or the fox. You see it different ways. The chicken, the grain, and the fox. The chicken, the grain, and the fox, you're at a river, and with you, you have a chicken, a bag of grain, and a fox. So let's draw this out. Y'all know that I'm a visual guy, and I like to try to do that. So over here, we got a chicken. Sorry, I'm in a hurry, because I don't want this video to be too long, so it might be a little bit kind of crappy looking. The grain that we have here, and then we got a fox. I don't even know what a fox looks like. I'm just going to draw like a cute little dog with pointy ears. How about that? He looks a little bit like, that's close, right? Okay. All right. So let me put some eyes to make it look more like a friend. Okay, there we go. Okay, so we got these three over here. Now, we can't leave them all together, because if we do, the chicken is going to eat that grain, but we also can't leave the chicken and the wolf or the fox together, because that fox is going to eat the chicken, right? So we need to get all three of these things over to the other side, and I do have this nice little canoe, but unfortunately this canoe right here, it only is able to take one thing over at a time. So I can only get in and take one of these across the way, but I need to take ultimately all three over. So what is the order in which you do this? Take a quick second to think to yourself. You can only take one over at a time, and you can't leave the chicken and the grain together, and you can't leave the chicken and the wolf together either. So, or the chicken and the fox, excuse me. So what do you do? So here's how most people do this riddle. First, they take over the chicken, right? Because the fox is not going to eat the grain. So you leave over the chicken, and then you come back, and then you grab, maybe it's the grain, and you bring it over there. And then before you come back, oh, nope, you can't come back, because if you leave the chicken and the grain, it's going to eat that. Okay, so we're not going to grab the grain this time. In fact, we're going to get the fox. And we're going to leave the fox. No, we can't do that either, because we can't leave the fox and the chicken together. So, oh, shoot, what do we do? Okay, maybe instead of taking the chicken, maybe this time we take the grain. So we're going to take the grain over there first. No, we can't do that, because then they're going to eat each other. What do we do? Okay, so maybe, hopefully you kind of explored this riddle to yourself, and tried to imagine what to do. It's, what people will call like a non-linear thinking problem, where it's, they want you to think non-linearly, and this is kind of what that means, is to not think about it in terms of first this, then this, then this, then this in a sequential order, because as you'll see here, the solution to this is easy but not straightforward. So the first thing you're going to do, you're going to take your chicken. Why is it not? There we go. Okay, we're taking the chicken over. We're going to leave it on this side. Then we're going to come back over, and let's say this time we're going to grab the grain. So that's going to be the second part. We're going to leave the grain there, but we're going to bring the chicken back. So we bring the chicken back, and then now this time the grain is just over there, so the chicken can't eat the grain. And so now we're going to take the wolf over there. We're going to leave the wolf, or sorry, the fox, with the grain. Then we're going to go back and get the chicken and then bring it back. So the chicken is both the first thing and the last thing that we're going to bring across the river. Now, the reason why this is such a great example of a problem-solving riddle is that the answer doesn't pop out to us immediately. In fact, as I mentioned, it's an easy answer, but it's not a straightforward one, right? So what do I mean about it not being straightforward? What I mean about it not being straightforward is that we generally like to move forward linearly when we are solving problems. So if you are trying to, actually I have a great, sorry, I'm going to show you this image right here. So this dog right here, this dog wants to get to this bone. So for him, the easiest, or at least in his mind, what it looks like he's doing is that the shortest route between him and this bone is right here, right? That is the shortest route, and yet he can't get there. And he doesn't want to move, because if he moves, then he's getting further away from the bone, right? Now, the reason why this is a funny comic is because we know that all the dog needs to do is take like 5 steps over this way, turn the fence, you know, and then he's able to get to it extremely easily. And yet, he doesn't seem to be able to make that connection, because if he moves this way, he's getting further away from the bone. That instinct is called the hill climbing strategy. So whenever we are trying to solve a problem, our instinct is that we're going to choose an option that is going to bring us closer to our goal, or closer to the solution of that problem, and we're going to pursue it. We don't want anything to get us further away from that goal solution. So this leads us to have a tendency to avoid what this dog is doing, or what the dog should be doing, which is that it should just take a few steps away, get further away, increase that distance between where you are and where your goal state is in order to solve it. So that tendency here, we see right here, where it feels weird to bring that chicken back across the river to where it initially was. It feels wrong. It feels like we're getting further away, and so we avoid that strategy. We don't even think about that as a strategy because it gets us further away from where we need to be. Now, usually this is a good thing. Usually this kind of tendency, this kind of instinct to want to keep getting closer and closer and closer to your goal state, it helps us solve a lot of problems, right? So like if your goal is to do well on an exam, then starting the study guide at the beginning and then going all the way down to the end until you finish it is a good strategy. That is a strategy that works. That is an example of hill climbing strategy. But maybe a slightly different strategy is to start watching the video, you bring out the study guide, you start answering some questions, and then you pause it, and then you go do something else. Then you read the chapter, then you whichever case, you're putting the study guide on hold. You're pausing it. And that sometimes we just want to get it out of the way. We just want to do it all at once. That is our hill climbing strategy tendencies kicking in. So we don't want to revert back to a previous state in our problem solving. All right. So that is one strategy. Another strategy is called means-ends analysis. And means-ends analysis is kind of like the hill climbing strategy, but it's a little bit more flexible. So basically what you're doing here is you are creating sub-goals. You're creating mini problems to solve. In many, I mean many, like M-I-N-I. I don't mean many as in M-A-N-Y, which sometimes comes out whenever my southern accent comes out, where many and many sound exactly the same. Where was I? Here with means-ends analysis, we're creating these smaller problems to solve along the way. So if I'm looking at this one more time, using means-ends analysis would help this dog out, because if this dog was like, okay, well, I can't decrease my distance any longer, this is not working, so maybe my next goal shouldn't be that I should get the bone. Maybe the next goal is that I should be on the other side of the fence. And if that's the strategy, then there's a totally different behavior this dog should be doing, and then the next goal can be get that bone. So a means-ends analysis is basically creating these sub-goals along the way to help you achieve this larger one. So it's very similar to the hill climbing strategy that we just went over. The key difference here is that if you are trying to get this bone, for example, and that's not working, it allows you to kind of change what the objective is, while also not abandoning your earlier strategy while you do this other thing. So here is kind of a diagram that kind of shows a little bit of what this looks like. So here, what we want to do is we want to match. Well, let me see. Where do I want to start here? Let's start over here. So let's say that we're searching for some kind of operator, and the operator here basically just means like anything that you use to solve a problem. So looking for any kind of behavior that might reduce the difference between where you are and where you need to be. If you don't find something, then okay, you fail, right? But what means ends analysis does is basically allows you to try to find what the next big kind of strategy might be, eliminate that difference, then try to come back over here, keep doing this, and then if you can't find the difference, then you can allow yourself to fail. But as long as you notice some difference between what your goal is and where you are, then that can help us create these smaller goals with the objective of the larger one in mind. Okay. Here's another quick example of this to show you, now that you know the hill climbing strategy and the means ends analysis, this is an example of a problem called the Tower of Hanoi. I don't remember exactly why it's called this. I think maybe this game or this strategy game originated from Hanoi. But basically what you have to do is you have these 3 pegs. And there's different variations of this game. Sometimes there are more pegs. Sometimes there's more of these discs right here. But your job is that you want to get these 5 discs over from post A over to post C. You can only move one at a time. And the kicker is that you cannot allow a heavier disc to be on top of a smaller disc. So think about that to yourself. Which of these would you move? You can only move one at a time. So think about that for a second. If you want to pause it, you can. So like for me, for example, and usually the way that this works, when I see people do this, they'll take this first one, they'll put it over here. They'll take the second one, they'll put it over here. They'll take the third one, and they're like, oh, okay, so now I'm going to take the small one. I'm going to put it on top of C. And then I'm going to take this one, put it over here. Now I'm going to take that smallest one, put it back over here. Then take the second one that's over on C, move it on top of the third biggest one. Then move the smaller one over here. And then I'm going to move this one right here over to C. And then, oh, now I'm stuck, right? So you can kind of do that strategy, and then you're going to get a little bit stuck. So let's take a look at how you would solve this. So if you were going to solve this, and this is with 4 instead of 5, but you can use the same idea either way. So here you can see how it looks a little bit like we are going further away from where we need to be. Do you see how that happened? Where we had everything over here and over here, and yet in order to solve this, we had to move things back to that start position. That is not a natural mindset for us to have. And this is why the Tower of Hanoi is tricky. Whenever researchers had participants come in and do the task, they had one group where they told them, solve it as you would naturally. But they also had another group come in and they told them, what we want you to do first is to really try to prioritize getting that bottommost piece to the final peg. That's the most important thing, and then you can think about the other stuff next. So they were basically using that means ends analysis to form this sub goal in the hopes of try to achieve this larger goal. All right, so, and they were able to do that. So basically, whenever people would only use the hill climbing strategy, they would get stuck and they would not be able to solve it. But creating those smaller goals allowed them to do it. Says means ends analysis. Another way that we can solve problems is through experience. So if we've encountered a similar problem in the past, then we can use those old solutions to try to solve those new ones. This can be a good thing, can also be a bad thing, because sometimes we have problem, we have solutions that have worked in our experience, and we just try to apply them to every new problem that we have. And you can probably think of some examples from your own life where you've tried something like that, and you see it with kids all the time, actually, where like the first time a kid learns that, like, if they say please, and give you the big baby eyes, that they'll get their way, right? So they'll keep doing that for everything that they can think of. Like, they want a specific kind of food, they'll say please, or they want a specific toy at the grocery store, please, right? So they'll keep trying this strategy because it worked in the past. And in this particular case, what you're looking at right here is this is actually, I'll just read it out loud. I was going to try to save some time, but I think it would be helpful to talk through this and work through it. So suppose you are a doctor faced with a patient who has a malignant tumor in his stomach. To operate on this patient is impossible, but unless the tumor is destroyed, the patient will die. A kind of ray at a sufficiently high intensity, so think like a laser, can destroy the tumor. Unfortunately, at this intensity, the healthy tissue that the rays pass through on the way to the tumor will also be destroyed. At lower intensities, the rays are harmless to healthy tissue, but will not affect the tumor. So how can the rays be used to destroy that tumor without injuring the healthy tissue? So this is a conundrum. You give this to a group of undergraduate students and they can't solve it. They'll look at it and they'll come up with some ideas, but they're almost always fatal to the patient here. But here's where things get interesting. Then the researchers go out. They bring in this quick little anecdote. So a dictator ruled a country from a strong fortress, and a rebel general, hoping to liberate the country, vowed to capture the fortress. The general knew that an attack by his entire army would capture the fortress, but he also knew that the dictator had planted mines on each of the many roads leading to the fortress. The mines were set so that small groups of soldiers could pass over them safely, since the dictator needed to move his own troops to and from the fortress. However, any large force would detonate the mines, blowing them up and also destroying the neighboring villages. The general knew, therefore, that he couldn't just march his army up one of the roads to the fortress. Instead, he devised a simple plan. He divided his army into small groups and dispatched each group to the head of a different road. When all were ready, he gave the signal, and each group marched up a different road to the fortress, with all groups arriving at the fortress at the same time. In this way, the general captured the fortress and overthrew the dictator. So, if you don't know why I'm giving you this anecdote, then maybe we should come back to this problem and see if we can figure out the solution now. Because essentially, they are the same problem. It's just this one is an allegory, right? It's an analogy for the other one. Where, in principle, we have a solution that can work, but we can't use the whole thing because the whole thing is dangerous. So what do? What we saw here is that we saw that there were smaller groups that then converged, and that helped, right? So the smaller groups didn't detonate the mines, which means if we apply that same logic here, we can do the same thing. Instead of having one ray attack the tumor, we can have smaller rays come from different directions so that they converge on that one area, and that could destroy the tumor without destroying the neighboring tissue. And this is a technique that surgeons do. So like this is grounded in reality. But what we see in this study is that whenever participants did not have a hint, you can see that their performance was pretty pitiful. 10% got the answer. Whenever people got an analogous problem provided, so if they just got, this first half of this story, you can see how much it increases performance. So they got a similar problem, and it just from having a similar problem, it increased performance about 20%. So about a third almost of people are getting correct now. But then, let's say that, like you see here, where they have the full story, now performance goes up to 75%. So it goes from 10 to 75% just because we were able to use some analogies. We were able to use similar kinds of problems and apply them to this new problem. All right. So those are some of the different ways that we are able to solve problems. So we have hill climbing strategies, which essentially is our tendency to try to minimize the distance between where we are and where we need to be. Sometimes that can be physical, right? But it can also be just conceptually. We also have the means-ends analysis, which is creating these smaller goals in the hopes of achieving this larger goal. We have solving problems with experience, where, like a surgeon who's done this many times before, they may know what the correct solution is because it has worked for them in the past. And then we also have problem solving with analogies, where we have a similar kind of thing that may be metaphorical, that we are able to take that lesson and apply it to a novel circumstance. All right, let's talk about problem representation now. So this is a classic problem. This is called the Duncker problem, because it's based on Carl Duncker, I believe. So in this, and this is from, I think the 20s. It might even be older than that, though, 1920s. You were given the object shown, and you may have heard this before. I had heard this already in like middle school and high school as like a brain teaser, so this you may already know the answer to this. You are given the object shown: a candle, a book of matches, and a book of tacks. Your task is to find a way to attach the candle to the wall of the room at eye level so that it will burn properly and illuminate the room. So there we go. So this is our initial state. So how do you get to this solution where you're putting that candle on the wall at eye level where it's not going to burn the house down, and it will also still be an effective at lighting up the room? I'll let you think about this for a second. I have a video here in case you want to see some people get stumped and they try to work through it themselves. And I also have a TED Talk video. You know I don't like TED Talk videos. I usually talk trash about TED Talk videos. But this one is kind of a fun and engaging one. And he talks about how whenever you give, I believe it's Dan Ariely, who, I could be wrong about this, but I think just a little bit of gossip between you and me, he was involved in like some like research data scandals not too long ago. And it seems like maybe he was above board, but his collaborator wasn't, or something like that. So he kind of got in trouble, but it looks like he's probably innocent. I don't know. You can Google it if you're interested in more of that Dan Ariely. But basically his point in that talk is explaining how if you incentivize people to solve this task, if you're like, hey, the first person who gets this task right, I'll give you $50, that those individuals do worse. That when you incentivize people with money on solving problems like this, or doing something creative, as we're going to talk about in just a little bit, that people's performance actually gets worse. And the reason why is because they fixate on things. They want that money, so they're going to keep trying the strategy over and over and over, trying to get it to work, even if they find that it doesn't work. So if you don't pay somebody and just ask them to do this and let them do it on their own time, where they're not rushed, they usually finish this faster than people who are paid to, which is really interesting, right? Because your manager probably tells you, like, yeah, I don't pay you enough to do X, Y, and Z, but sometimes payment can actually get in the way of the labor or the problem or whatever kind of creative task we were trying to do. Okay, so did you think of the solution yet? I tried to give you some time to let this mull around in your head, to incubate. So the way to solve this, usually when I ask this in the classroom, I get a couple of people who are extremely confident, and they'll be like, yeah, all you got to do, take some tacks and just stick that baby to the wall and then light it up. And it's like, okay, but then if you light it up, it's going to burn the house down. And then they'll say something like, yeah, but then you'll already have the insurance money and you can run away and you can live in Miami or whatever. And it's like, number one, I don't think that my home insurance is going to give me enough money to live in Miami. It's very expensive to live down there. But second of all, no, it's got to burn properly. You can't just like burn the house down to solve this task. So it's not that. It's also not that you can like burn the candle so that it gets all mushy and then like stick it to the wall while it's cooling so the wax affixes it to the wall. It doesn't work like that either. The solution is very annoying. The solution is that you're going to take all the tacks out, you're going to spill them out onto the table, and you're going to use this book of tacks now as a platform. So you're going to use it like this. Or you could even tilt the box a different way, but the principle is the same. They're using the box as a platform, and you're just using that tack to affix it to the wall. So why is this so annoying? Whenever I talk about this, when I do this in the class, people get annoyed. And when I ask, well, why are you annoyed? They're like, well, because you didn't tell us that we could use the book of tacks like that. And that is exactly the issue. That is exactly the problem, is that sometimes we think about the use of a tax or of a tack in a very specific way. And that can blind us from the other possibilities of what this box of tacks might actually do for us. So I got another example for you. So in this one, I actually have an embedded video, so we're going to watch this one. But same idea. Same idea applies, where you can get an iPhone for cheap. You can get all three of them, apparently, from Verizon. Come on.
You can take this test.
So you already know that there's going to be some kind of lateral thinking here, right? This isn't a linear problem. So can you solve it?
Right from your living room.
This is a simple game, really. All you have to do is tie two ropes together. The problem is these two ropes don't easily reach each other. So that's going to require you to come up with a creative solution. You have a chair, a paint can, and a pair of pliers that you can use to solve this problem.
Take a second and consider what you would do to tie this 5-foot rope to this 4-foot rope. Keep trying as these columns.
All right, so do you get the idea that basically you have these two straps that you want to connect? So how do you do it with the tools you have provided?
You understand what you have to do?
I gotcha.
Tie the ropes together?
Yes.
You can't reach both ropes from the floor, but simply standing on the chair won't help. You're going to have to get creative.
I'm going to tie the chair.
Okay.
Seem impossible? We assure you, it can be done.
Yeah, it's not going to work.
Do you feel like giving up too? Well, before you do, let's find out what might be standing in your way.
When you're trying to think of uses for the objects that are in the room, you have a hard time thinking of a use.
All right, so have you figured out the solution yet? Have you thought about it? Have you thought about what you might need to do? You saw the tools that they have, but you already know that you're not supposed to use the tools like they're normally used, right? Because the previous example, and hey, if you're doing that, then you are solving based on experience and using analogies, right? You looked at how something worked in a similar context, and you're trying to draw the lessons from that context to apply it to this one.
That you haven't encountered in your lifetime.
You're not born knowing what a paint can is, but over time, you form associations, such as what a paint can looks like and how it works. Object association is an activity that takes place in a region of the temporal lobe.
If we can prime people to think of a can of paint in a completely different way, that can really help us solve the problem instantly.
So, how does this apply to the ropes challenge and the objects provided? First, you have to add weight to one rope to create a pendulum. What can you use for weight? Here's where that creative thinking comes in handy.
You've gotten very close. You're very close.
Swing the paint can pendulum. Then, while holding onto the other rope, stand on the chair and catch the pendulum as it swings in your direction. With the ends of the ropes now in close proximity, you can release the paint can and tie the ropes.
Yeah! Okay. You got it. Yeah.
Did it.
Good job.
That was not easy.
Have you ever used a paint can as a pendulum before?
No, I have not.
Is it the first time?
Yes, it is. I need to get in the gym.
Okay, all right. Everybody had a fun time. How nice. Okay, so this is an example of what's called functional fixedness. So in functional fixedness, what we are highlighting is how for these individuals in this video, that what they were using, or what they should have been using, is this paint can as a pendulum. But we don't think about paint cans as serving that function. Instead, we think of them as kind of having the same function as that box of tacks, right? That they are used mostly to hold things, to hold paint inside of it, right? That we don't think about it as serving as a pendulum that you can attach to one end of this and then swing it. I like that one guy who decided to like try to tie the tie a chair to that and then like use that to like stretch it. Like that's very funny, and maybe could have been on the right track if he used that as a pendulum, maybe as the chair as a pendulum. All right, so with functional fixedness, we see these things as having very specific kinds of functions, very specific kinds of uses, and this blocks out our ability to think about what they could be used for. Another example of this is like if you're sitting at a table that has like one of those chairs where one leg is so much shorter than the other one. It can be really frustrating, right? And we usually forget that, like, oh yeah, we could easily just take like a sheet of paper, we could fold it up so that it's nice and thick, and then just put that underneath that leg of the chair, and then it totally stops. We don't think about paper or a napkin as serving that kind of purpose because we think of paper as being something that you write on. We think of it as something you wipe your mouth with, not something that you kind of balance the chairs with. So this is okay. So that's functional fixedness. Here we have problem sets. So we're looking at how a problem is presented to you can sometimes change the way that we solve it. This is a classic problem called the 9-dot problem, and the goal here is that you want to draw 4 straight lines that are going to pass through all 9 dots without lifting your pencil from the page. And I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, do I remember this? I think I do remember the solution for this one. So usually when people do this, they will start and they'll be like, all right, 1, 2, 3, shoot. It can't be a curve, right? So that doesn't work. What about this? And then this, and then that. Nope, that doesn't work either. So the way you can solve this one is by thinking literally outside of the box, where you can go like this. You can start over here. I'm gonna knock out these 3. I'm coming down my second line, third line, fourth line. Boom. Didn't lift the pen up from the stylus. And hey, that I missed. Okay. Yes, officer. Maybe I had a few drinks tonight, and maybe that's why. I'm just kidding. It's not even night. It's in the morning. This is the rare time I'm recording in the morning. Where here the lines didn't pass through the shapes. That's just because I have a very shaky hand on a stylus, as you can see. But here is another example of problem sets and how thinking outside of the box can help us solve these problems. So here is another example, another problem. There are 62 squares on this chessboard and you have 31 dominoes. The top left, as you can see here, and the bottom right squares have been removed. You can fit 1 domino on 2 squares at a time. Can you fill this chessboard up? So if you do the math, this feels like it works, right? It feels like, okay, I got 31 dominoes, I got 62 squares, I can do that. I can fill that up, right? We just remove these 2 right here, that's it? Yeah, so we should be able to fill that up. But go on and try it. If you try it, it's not going to work. You won't be able to fill up the chessboard. Why? Why do people get confused with this? Because again, think a little bit outside of the box. Instead of thinking about this in terms of a math problem, think about this in terms of what squares have been removed. We got this square removed and this square removed. Both those squares, by the way, are white squares, right? So if that's true, and we know that these dominoes can only occupy a black square and a white square at any given time, we know that this is not going to work. And we know that because we would have enough if there was an equal number of white squares and black squares, but we already know that's not true. There's more black squares than white squares, meaning that these dominoes are not going to fit on that board. So we dropped my stylus. So we feel, again, thinking back to the decision-making chapter, we feel like we can solve this, and we feel like we can do it accurately. However, when we think about it a slightly different way, when we think about this not in terms of math or probabilities, but in terms of thinking about it visually, imagining, each of these dominoes occupying a black and a white, a black and a white, and a black and a white, you'll see that it then doesn't fit quite literally. This reminds me, thinking about problem sets reminds me a lot of Abraham Maslow's quote. Abraham Maslow came up with the hierarchy of needs, if y'all remember that. I'm not a huge fan of the hierarchy of needs because I'm a hardcore skeptic, as y'all know. But if you learned about that in Psych 101, then he is famous for that. And one of his quotes that I really love is that whenever all you have is a hammer, every problem in the world looks like a nail. And what that means, the wisdom of that quote, basically means that if you have a strategy that you know works for your problems, that you will try to use that strategy on every particular problem. And we see this with people probably in your life all the time, where you have somebody who is like a really smooth talker and really charismatic, and they will try to use that to get out of every single situation, right? And that maybe feels a little bit manipulative. So let me think of another one. So my father is really good with carpentry. So quite literally, he's good with hammers. And so if we are trying to if we're trying to fix something, if we're trying to, maybe this isn't a good example, but like if I were to try to fix something in my car, his first instinct is going to be, let's see if we can work this out. Let's see if we can break out our tools and go in and fix it. And then I'm like, wait a second, this tool we do not have. We need to take this to a professional. Somebody like my dad might be like, well, actually, hold on. Let's try to use the pliers this way and see if it works, right? So basically, because those things worked in the past, we feel like they'll work for every problem. That's not always true, as we have seen. Okay, sometimes creativity can help. So let's talk a little bit about creativity. Creativity and memory are very highly linked, and most people don't think about that. When people think about creativity, if somebody is a creative person, we usually take that to mean that they think outside the box, that they are, what's a synonym for creative? That they are imaginative, that they are good at seeing alternatives, at seeing alternative ways of viewing the world. So the way they see the world might be a little bit different, right? So what the hell does it have to do with memory? Well, the thing about creativity is that creativity is also about problem solving. And those of you that are creative people probably know this, right? So like if you're a painter and you're painting, you can paint by numbers if you want to, but then there comes a time where it's like, oh, I need a color that I don't have. So what do? I need to mix these together. Or maybe a little bit of a better example, you're trying to sketch someone's face and it's not quite working out. So you got to step back and you got to think like, What's the problem here? It's like the cheeks aren't full enough, so maybe I should like raise the eye or lower the eye a little bit on this face. There's a lot of problem solving that goes into creativity, and a lot of that stuff you get better at as you conquer more of those problems. So drawing faces, for example, you'll get better at drawing faces because you'll think about all the things that you did in the past that didn't work. About how if you used to draw eyes like this and they were a little bit too boxy, and so now you know that they should be a little bit more almond shaped or a little bit more rounder. So and hey, look at that, drawing connections. That's quite a pun for a creativity slide, right? So creative people can be good at problem solving because thinking outside the box can sometimes allow them to see the connections that exist between problems that may not be super obvious. So creative people are usually really good at solving problems using analogies, where they are like, hey, this worked for me in the past in a different context. I mix colors then, maybe I can mix this totally separate set of colors for this totally different project, and maybe that can work. So there are a couple of prerequisites, quote unquote, for creativity. So I thought this would be kind of a fun thing to go over, not in any kind of super, not into a whole lot of depth or whatever, but just kind of think about them a little bit. That when we talk about creative people, that generally, in order to be creative, this is what psychologists have noticed among many case studies that look at creative individuals, painters and musicians and all that. So number one, they need to have skill and they need to have knowledge in the domain. We sometimes will hear about somebody who never took any lessons and they're a virtuoso or whatever, right? And that's all well and good. But they still have to develop those skills. And while they're developing those skills, they'll usually learn a lot about the instrument. And so, or the the visual medium or the spoken word medium or whatever the medium is. But you need to know the basics, the fundamentals of how those things work in order to do it. So you can still teach yourself this stuff, but in teaching yourself, you're going to pick these things up. So I know it seems kind of obvious, but I just mean to say that there aren't people like Picasso, for example. People use him as like an example of a fantastic painter. Dude knew what he was doing. He had the knowledge and he had the skill. I know that, again, might seem obvious, but just want to make sure that we cover that first. Second is that there are certain personality traits that load on to creative individuals. Those generally work out to two big ideas. One is that creative people are willing to take risks. So again, thinking about painting, for example, and if you're like, hey, I'm not so sure if, mixing these colors are going to work, somebody who's not creative will be like, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't do that then. But somebody who is creative is like, no, I want to get this. I want to figure this out, right? And so they're gonna tinker with it a little bit until it's just right. So there's some willingness to take risks, but there's also, you need to be able to ignore criticism. Because if you're creative, people are going to try to judge your work, and that includes you, right? So you want to be able to have a thick skin and be able to not, and I don't mean this like that you don't care about criticism, but that there are some criticisms that you are willing to ignore, where you're like, yeah, I know that's a problem, but I don't care, So the ability to kind of not worry about what other people are going to think all the time, because that can be paralyzing, and it can also make you fall back on old solutions because we have that heightened level of pressure. I mentioned how if you pay people to solve creative problems, that usually makes them slower. Same idea with creative, which is also kind of why sometimes you see a lot of musicians, for example, who, when they're on top of the world, they have all the best songwriters and studios at their command, and their album sucks and their songs suck, and it's because they don't want to take risks and because they're thinking about the criticism. They're too worried about what people on social media are going to say, and they're not making the music that they love. They're making the music that they think people want to hear, which is usually garbage. No offense. The third thing, creative people are motivated by intrinsic motivators. What that means is that generally creative people enjoy what they do. They paint because they like painting, not because it earns them a bunch of money. I like playing music because it is fun, not because it makes me a lot of money, even though that is how I paid my way through undergrad, is playing in a southern rock band, believe it or not. We played a lot of country music. I do not like country music. Please do not ask me about country music. But I was a sellout. I was hustling, and I paid for my textbooks that way. All right, and then finally, situational factors. That there are some cases where people just need to be in the right place at the right time in order for their careers to take off as creative individuals. And like as an example, like Claude Monet, for example. Monet, one of the best visual painters of all time, but he was in Paris in the 1800s at a very particular time whenever other people were really interested in these kinds of ideas and this method of abstraction and impressionism. And so if he was in, I don't know, the middle of the Mojave Desert and had all these same skills, probably would not have been noticed, right? So if you're a creative person and your career is not taking off, sometimes, unfortunately, some of it can just be luck-based. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about incubation and insight. These are two big driving factors in creativity. So insight is something that people also talk a lot about when we were talking about problem solving. Insight is whenever things click and you feel like you have an aha moment. Oftentimes, these are the products of previous experiences and previous associations that we have made, but they have just popped into our head and we are able to solve them. So why do they pop into our head? Oftentimes it is because we have allowed those ideas to incubate. This is some of the best advice that I ever got in cognitive psychology whenever I took cognitive psychology. I remember my professor said, did you know that when you're working on a problem and you can't figure out the solution and you take a break from it, that you might feel like you're moved on, but that somewhere in your brain there are still wheels turning, that there are still some background processes that are doing their thing and kind of working on this problem. And if you do that, it's not like you're abandoning the task. You're just letting your brain kind of do its quote-unquote subconscious thing. Now, I don't like that terminology because it sounds very Freudian to talk about subconscious. It makes it sound like your subconscious has a mind of its own, but it doesn't. Your subconscious is your mind. It's just the part that you're not directly thinking about. So this turns out to be highly effective. That if you get stuck on something, those of you that are gamers out there, I know that you have experienced something like this before, where you're playing Elden Ring, you're playing Dark Souls, you're playing a really hard game, you're up against a really hard boss, you're playing them a bunch, you're making no progress, boss kicking your butt, then you take a break of a couple of days, then you come back to it, and then you beat the boss on the first try, right? How many times does that happen to you? So you allow that incubation period to occur, and this allows some of those previous strategies that you may not have considered, or these perspectives that you may not have thought of, to kind of go up to the surface. But it also allows you time to allow some of those old associations that may have worked that you weren't using to also pop up as well. So if you ever get stuck and you're really working on a song that you want to work and it's not happening, I know you want to just kind of go at it and be diligent, but it can actually be a really good idea to take a step back, focus on something else, let your brain do its magic, and then come back and do this. And again, I hate talking about the brain like this because it's not a magical thing. It's a really impressive organism, but it's not magic. It does obey the laws of science. Even if we can't directly see that incubation happening, or we can't feel it happening, it is happening for us. It also prevents burnout, which is extremely helpful. If we're trying over and over and over to finish this boss on a video game, or to finish this painting that we can't quite nail, we can get really burned out on it and really unhappy with the process, and then just lose our joy of whatever that creative pursuit is, which, as we said, is one of the things that you need in order to be a creative person, is that intrinsic reward. Here's the Yerkes-Dodson law. I love the Yerkes-Dodson law. Very, very interesting. Once you think about it a little bit, you'll see it in your life all around you. But the Yerkes-Dodson law maintains that whenever you are problem solving, whenever you're participating in creative pursuits, that there is an optimal level of arousal in order to do very well, to excel, to succeed on something. So that's what we see right here. Is on the y-axis we have performance. So how good are you at something, at doing something? And on the x-axis we have very low arousal over here, or very low stress is maybe a way you can think about it. And over here we have high stress or high arousal. And again, I don't mean arousal in the erotic way, so get your head out of the gutter. I mean physiological arousal. So what this shows is that if you are, so imagine something in your life that's important to you. Maybe it's sports, maybe it is art, maybe it is getting to know people, maybe it is taking an exam. Actually, we'll use taking an exam because that applies to everybody, right? So if you're taking an exam, is it good to be extremely stressed out for that exam? No, we know it's not, right? Because if you have a lot of stress, if somebody is like, hey, if you don't pass this exam with a 95, you're going to fail the class. And then if you fail the class, you're going to have all your financial aid removed. And if that's the case, you're going to have to drop out of college. That is a lot of stress. And what happens is that can lead to anxiety, and can lead to panic, and can lead to suboptimal performance. You can imagine the same thing happening on game day if you're an athlete, right? If somebody is really in your head and it's like you really got to do well or else you're never going to play again, can make you really nervous and you can play really badly. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, over here in the low stress circumstance, what happens if you take an exam and you just don't give a shit, right? So you just don't care. Sorry to use cuss words, but let's say you just don't care at all. If that's the case and you're taking an exam, You're not going to double check your work. You're maybe going to go too fast through it. You're not going to think critically. That can be really bad as well. So we do our best work on the sports field, on stage, on an exam, when we are somewhere between those two. That performance is best when we are challenged, but not exhausted. Where we are a little bit more than just alerted, so we feel like we are challenged. And usually whenever people do amazing sports feats, it's not because they're playing a super easy game, right? It's usually because they're in a really high stakes game, and they get into that flow state, and so they are experiencing challenge. But they're not letting their fear or their anxiety get the best of them. And they're not feeling exhausted yet. They're not burned out yet. Nor are they bored. But they're right here in this Goldilocks zone. So I hope that you think about that too not just whenever you're problem solving, not just whenever you are doing creative things, but whenever you are studying for an exam. Think about the Yerkes Dodson function and about how a little bit of stress is a good thing. A little bit of stress is a great thing. A little bit of stress has us perform at our peak. Too much stress, bad. Not enough stress, also bad. Okay, let's get into our final stretch here by talking about intelligence. So intelligence, we spent a lot of time talking about what a problem is, what problem solving is at the beginning of this chapter, and we could spend even longer talking about intelligence in this way. Whenever I teach Psych 101, we have an entire chapter about intelligence, and I spend a long time making this point, that what intelligence is really depends on how we decide to measure it. So if I think about the crows at the beginning of this video, if you define intelligence as problem solving, then yeah, it looks like crows are really, really smart. But if we use language as an assessment of intelligence, or reading comprehension, then no, those animals are bad. Those non-humans are quite poor at problem solving, right? So that is an example of sorry, I blanked out. About defining your terms, about operationally defining what it is that you're doing. With intelligence, this is paramount. This could not be more important. So let's look at a couple of ways that people have measured intelligence in the past. IQ, which is also called the intelligence quotient, this is probably the most famous of all of them, right? So whenever people are talking about somebody else being dumb, they'd be like, oh wow, you must have a really low IQ, right? Really what they're trying to say is that, oh yeah, you must be dumb. And what they mean by that is that, I guess that means they would perform poorly on an IQ exam. So what does that mean really? It means that they'd be bad at analogies, that maybe their reading comprehension is not great, and that their symbolic logic and reasoning is suboptimal. That's kind of weird, right? If you have a low IQ, there's a lot of things that you're still probably great at. It's just that this test isn't directly measuring them. So IQ is a measurement. What it predicts is not how quote-unquote smart you are. What it predicts is your future success. And your future success in this light is dictated by social outcomes and by economic outcomes. So if you score really high on an IQ test, that means that you are more likely to have lots of friends, more likely to stay out of prison, more likely to have a high-paying job, and more likely to have a happy family. What does any of that stuff really have to do with intelligence, right? I feel like not a whole lot. You can probably think of really smart people that have gone to prison. You can think of really smart people that have really bad families. You can think of really smart people who have really shitty careers, right? So it's weird then that we use the IQ test in such high regard and such high esteem whenever all it really does is predicts your future success later in life. So here is a quick kind of definition of intelligence. So the ability to reason, plan, solve problems, think abstractly, comprehend complex ideas, learn quickly, and learn from experience. And I think kind of I don't know, to me, this right here, the ability to adapt is really important. We're going to be looking at ways that we can break down and separate intelligence, because you can probably think of some people who are really good at planning, really good at thinking abstractly, can comprehend really complex ideas, but are not good at learning from their mistakes, right? And so, in order for somebody to be high intelligence, quote unquote, does that mean they need to be good at all these things? I don't think so. And I think that's one of the things that I hope that we all kind of take out of this class, is that when we're talking about non-humans, for example, when I was finding that video about the crow, I saw some people saying something like, crows had the intelligence of a 7-year-old. And as much as I love that people are like, hey, did you know that non-humans are smarter than we thought, that we give them credit for? Y'all know that is something that I'm passionate about. But to me, it's apples and oranges. A 7-year-old can use language. A 7-year-old can do long division, right? And that's very different than a crow, like adding in rocks in order to raise a larva up so it can eat it. Does that make sense? So, what I mean to say here is that when we talk about intelligence, I think it's a little bit of a fool's errand to say, here's one score that encapsulates all of this stuff. Instead, what we should be doing is thinking about how are we measuring intelligence, because if we're looking at those specific behaviors, that can tell us, like, for example, somebody might bomb the IQ test because they have dyslexia, and that is an issue with reading and with the sounds of words, right? Has nothing to do with their ability to reason, to plan, to solve problems, to think abstractly, to comprehend complex ideas, to learn quickly and to learn from experience. Dyslexia has nothing to do with any of those things. However, somebody who has dyslexia might perform poorly because of dyslexia. So I hope that kind of makes sense. That when we talk about intelligence, we need to be very careful with what we mean here, because it really depends on how it is that we are measuring it. All right. Just a few more slides here that I want to talk about is that generally intelligence tests today are not about how much you know. It's not about trivia questions like who wrote Sherlock Holmes, or how many miles is the circumference of the Earth, or how long does it take to get from the sun to the Earth in light speed. Instead, it's usually questions about problem solving and symbolic logic and making decisions and planning and things like that. Things that, I don't know, is that an example of intelligence? So, intelligence scales are actually going to be measuring a lot of different things that we have talked about all semester. So we've talked a lot about memory, about attention, about reasoning and logic, and about comprehension, specifically of language. All of these things are used when we are talking about measuring intelligence. And the gold standard these days is something called the WAIS. So the old one is the Stanford Binet IQ test. If anybody takes that and starts bragging about their IQ, you can just roll their eyes, because that's like really outdated, and the only people who care about that stuff is people who don't know what they're talking about. So it's always fun to go on Reddit or TikTok and have people bragging about their Stanford Binet IQ test, because like no serious person has cared about that since the 80s. And I'm sorry for anybody out there who that is bad. I don't mean to be offensive or sassy. But that's just say that your friend who's been bragging about their 130 IQ, nobody cares. Or at least people who actually study this stuff, they don't care. So the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale is often shortened to the WAIS. The WAIS, widely used today, is used a lot, especially in middle and high schools, whenever people are coming up with individualized educational plans. So if you've ever heard of an IEP, those are often used to help come up with accommodations for learning impairments and things like that. And so the key idea here is that intelligence is made up of several different cognitive processes. So here is kind of a flow of what we're looking at, where with the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, you can factor out to 1 IQ score. So if you wanted to, you can get 1 IQ score, but the really important piece of it is how it divides up into smaller pieces. So we can have a verbal IQ and we can have a performance IQ. What does that mean? The verbal IQ is going to be for problems and for questions and for behaviors that require some access to language. So as we can see here, we're talking about tests that measure vocabulary, tests that measure analogies and similarities, tests that measure information processing, tests that measure reading comprehension, and that we also have tests that measure your ability to arithmetic, that do digit span tasks, letter number sequencing. So here, letter number sequencing is like you have this diagram, and it's like if you see this symbol, you have to it's like you have to quickly arrange letters and numbers from lowest to smallest and in alphabetical order as well. So much like the O-span task that we talked about at the beginning of the memory chapters. So all of these require language. Even arithmetic, because that is going to be mental math, so saying it to yourself and all that. So verbal IQ is going to be that, and that is totally separate from performance IQ. So performance IQ is going to be like using matrix reasoning. Let me show you what that is. So this is an example of a matrix reasoning task. So if you were to see, let's look at this one over here first. So if you were to see this and you're asked to fill in what is the missing symbol here, and all you have are these 8 grids, which of these would best complete that grid? It is, let me check. I was gonna say, actually, I'm struggling to think about what it might be. Oh, it should be 3, right? Because as we can see, as we are... Wait, no. Is that not right? Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, it's 3. And then over here, you can apply the same thing. For this one is actually a little bit easier as well. This one would be C. Would fill in this one right here. And if you don't see it, and if you don't know why, think about it a little bit harder, and you might see why that is. So in order for us to solve those, we didn't need to talk through it. We didn't need language in order to be able to do that. Also, picture completion. This is where there's a complicated picture of a room, and there's maybe something missing, and you have to identify what it is. Symbol search. This is very similar to the visual search task that we talked about at the beginning of the semester. So, like I mentioned, a lot of these things we've been talking about all semester. And so it's possible for someone to, excel on... Actually, let me use a more concrete example. In chapter 7 and 8 and 9, we talked about the effects of language and how that affected memory. And I talked about Stephen Wiltshire. And Stephen Wiltshire was this young man who didn't speak until much later in life, like 7 or 8, I believe. And I talked about how his brain is essentially really good at visual information and not so good at verbal information. And so if he was doing this test, he'd probably not do so well with verbal IQ. He's just not really good with language. But he's exceptional at these other things. And so this is extremely helpful to know if you were Stephen Wiltshire's parent, working with him in middle school, and you're like, oh, I see. So it's just that he has some deficits in his ability to pick up vocabulary, his ability to draw verbal symbolic analogies. But he is spot on with matrix reasoning tasks and with picture completion. He's amazing at these things. So knowing this can really help individuals if they're going to high school and they're like, hey, I have some deficits in performance IQ, but I'm really good at verbal IQ. This can help individuals know if there are going to be certain topics they wrestle with, that they might need a little bit of assistance with, but also what areas that they might be really good at they can use to kind of overcompensate for some of those deficits. There are some waste questions which you can find out right here. You can't, as far as I know, on the internet, you're not supposed to record videos of this stuff in action. I did find a couple whenever I was looking on YouTube, but usually they're really good at scrubbing that stuff and erasing it. Why? Why do they not want that stuff online? They don't want that stuff online so that way, like, if you are coming in and you're trying to game the system, they don't want you to know. And I mean that, like let's say maybe you need some kind of individualized educational plan, but because it's stigmatized and you feel a little bit weird about it, you want to do really well on these tests. So maybe you study for them and you practice on them. You don't want that. That defeats the whole purpose of taking the test. So if you want to learn more about the test, you can here. You can check out some of those sub tasks, but I wouldn't recommend like watching the whole 8 hour, because it takes a long time to go through all of this, the whole 8 hour video of somebody going through this process. All right. There are, as I mentioned, as I hinted at, people think of intelligence now not just as one central intelligence, but as multiple kinds of intelligence. So one common view is of fluid intelligence versus crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence is, you can think of this as, I don't know if this lingo is outdated, but this was the lingo whenever I was growing up, is we would call it, actually, this is going to be funny, one second. We call it street smarts. I feel like people still call it that, where they talk about street smarts versus book smarts. And the idea behind that is that there are some things in your life that, like, it doesn't matter if you're like valedictorian, brainiac. You might not be able to figure out how to get from Springfield to New Haven, right? Which maybe you can take a train, you can grab a bus, you gotta talk to people, you gotta figure it out and plan a little bit, right? You probably know some people who, like, when they travel, they are really bad at it and they get totally overwhelmed and lost, right? So we would say they don't have good street smarts. Or like they go and they're playing 3-card Monte, right? Which is that game where it's like you got 3 cups and you got the prize under one of them and the guy is like switching it around. And everybody knows it's a scam. Everybody knows it's a trick. And so you might have somebody who doesn't know it's a trick because they have very poor street smarts but have really high book smarts. What we mean by that is that that individual has high fluid intelligence but has low crystallized intelligence. Now, me growing up in the South, we did call it street smarts, obviously, but some people did also call this, and I think this is so funny, swamp wise. So you can be street smart and swamp wise. So obviously to not play with a wild animal, right? That's being swamp wise. So fluid intelligence is really referring to your ability to kind of deal with new problems, to adapt on the fly, to apply new strategies where they are useful. And crystallized intelligence is more kind of like the more traditional way of thinking about intelligence, where we're talking about stuff that you might learn from a book. So a lot of that semantic memory information, knowledge that accrues over time. And what we see is that crystallized intelligence, those book smarts, quote unquote, that those do increase over time, and that our fluid intelligence decreases with age, which honestly kind of, you can probably see that making sense to you, right? That, like, the example that I gave about going from Springfield to New Haven, like, I would trust you to do that because most of you are quite young. I would not trust my 97-year-old grandmother to do that on her own, right? I would expect that she might get a little bit confused and a little bit lost and a little bit stressed out. So, and I don't have a 97-year-old grandmother, by the way, so don't feel bad for her. She's imaginary. So these things do change over time. So your intelligence is not completely fixed. As much as the proponents of the Stanford Binet model, that one, the classic one, they will tell you that IQ does not change over time. What other researchers will say is that, well, it depends on how you measure it. And what we see is that depending on how you measure it, yes, it actually can change over time. Okay, and actually before I talk a little bit about that, I do also want to come back to the different kinds of intelligence, because sometimes I get people asking me about Howard Gardner's. Sorry, let me just write this out. I told you I'm so bad at multitasking, but writing and talking. If I'm going to be good at YouTube, I got to be able to be good at that, right? Because I can't just let there be dead silence. But Howard Gardner's theories of multiple intelligences. Basically, this is something that almost every semester somebody asks me about in the classroom. I don't want to cover it because I don't like it. Sorry, I'm being a hater. But basically, the multiple intelligences theory is this notion that not only do we have fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence, we also have emotional intelligence, musical intelligence, visual intelligence, mathematical intelligence, social intelligence, what else? Historical intelligence, grammatical, sort of phonological intelligence, so with words and stuff like that. So basically, he's arguing that you can take intelligence, you can slice it up into a bunch of different smaller subsections, and that you can have some people who are really, really talented musically. So they have really high musical intelligence, but have maybe really poor mathematical intelligence, right? And that's a really tempting, really appealing model. The issue with it is that, number one, it's just not really supported in cognitive psychology. And the reason why is because whenever people test this stuff, there's not really areas of the brain that are like, here's your musical intelligence module, here's your phonological intelligence module, here's your mathematical intelligence module. That's not exactly how it works. But also, you can kind of keep dividing this up into smaller and smaller pieces. So if you wanted to, using the same logic, you could have musical intelligence, but inside musical intelligence, now you can have melodic intelligence, which is how good you are with melody, which would be like Mozart is really good with melody. But you can also have intelligence for rhythm. So people who are really good at rhythm, like DJ Mustard, for example. Or any other, Metro Boomin, or whoever your favorite producer of the moment is. So you can kind of split that up, and then maybe you could have okay, well, this person is a trap genius, and this person is an electronica genius. They're both rhythmically intelligent, but it's different kinds of rhythmic intelligence. So you can see that it just splits up into smaller and smaller pieces of the pie until it essentially just means how good is this person doing that task. Right? And that's not really all that helpful. So that's why, and I think the education department, I think they still teach Gardner's theories of multiple intelligences. And there even might be some areas of psychology that do, but at least in cognitive psychology, we kind of see it as a little bit of a relic of the 80s, just to be honest with you. Alright, so I just wanted to cover that. And then finally, the last thing that I want to mention is the effects of environment on IQ. There is a lot of debate over how much of IQ is inherited. This comes up once every 20 years or so. And in the 90s, it was a hot button issue where people thought that IQ was inherited. And then people will use that to try to make arguments about what races are smarter. And I know that seems like a crazy thing to talk about, but they talked about it a lot in the 90s, and it has come back, right? So now on the internet, people will like to say oh, this group is smarter than this group, and we can look at the data to show that. But what I wanted to show you before you believe any of those things, because they're almost always discredited, and it's so frustrating because the people that trot that stuff out online, that fake intelligence test stuff, it's like if they just took that same amount of critical reasoning skills that they're trying to do to argue for this racist bullshit, if they took that same studiousness and actually applied it to actually learning how this stuff works, they'd probably be good at it, right? Because they clearly spend a lot of time and are really emotional and wrapped up in all this stuff only for it to be wrong. They're just very confident about that they're wrong. And they also love to say oh yeah, well, they're not going to tell you this, the university is not going to tell you this. Please, you have taken psychology class, or you've taken classes. You know, professors love to talk about controversial stuff. They love to be like, well, actually, everybody believes this, but it's actually this. You know, professors love to do that stuff. So don't you think that if there was some kind of truth to, like, you know, the inheritability of IQ as it pertains to race and all this other stuff, that don't you think that there would be, like, a bunch of professors who were like, you know, they're not going to tell you this on whatever, but this is, you know, this is how it actually works. But instead, you don't see anybody doing that. So it really makes you think about, so why the people online, why are they so passionate about this then? Anyways, what I wanted to show you, instead of talking about that, is that there are differences in IQ as they pertain to our environment. Now, this is one of those things that proponents of IQ tell you. They will tell you it doesn't matter about the environment. That IQ, as I mentioned, is stable and it doesn't change over time. This graph, this research is showing you the exact opposite. It does. What we're looking at is some adoption studies, and they are looking at individuals, and they've done this with twin studies as well. So they're looking at folks that were raised in a working class environment, low social economic status, a middle class environment, and a upper class, rich folk environment. And what you see is that before adoption, that the outcomes were all pretty much the same for these individuals. Then after they are adopted, and once they're in adolescence, so once they're, you know, 12 years old or whatever, we start seeing some big changes in what their IQ was. So not only does it change over time, we also see that it changes depending on the resources you have available to you. So up here, we have people who are in the wealthy classes have a higher IQ. Their IQ bumped up 15 points, an entire standard deviation. Those that were in the working class, it did bump up, but it only bumped up like 5 points or whatever. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that it does change over time. It does depend on what resources you have available to you, because in the high social economic status, they're able to hire tutors. They're able to send their students to the finest, you know, prep schools and private academies and, you know, summer camps dedicated for, you know, music or whatever. They're able, you know, to buy the best technology and stuff like that. And we act like it doesn't give people an advantage, but it clearly does. So next time you see somebody online who tries to argue, because what this always comes back to is that the rich folks are rich because they have high IQs, and the poor folks are poor because they have low IQs. Hopefully this shows you that that's actually kind of bullshit, right? That what we see is that if you take somebody and you switch them to a different social economic status, it does absolutely change their effects on an IQ test. And that's all that I want to talk about today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Sorry we had to end it on such a heavy note, but that's how it be sometimes. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you later. Bye, everybody.